Okay, so this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I've taught cross-cultural psychology for many years, and this topic is one that clearly interests most of my students. The main thing about this is these are two forms of identity, different kind of cells, but they come out of social organizations. So, for example, what I'm going to do and how I talk about this is go from the sociological and historical context gradually to like social psychology and then psychology. So I'm going to start with the big picture and then narrow the focus. So the first thing is that collectivists today are, believe it or not, 80% of the world population. That might make more sense to you if you consider that typically collectivist societies are either agricultural states or they're horticulture states. Horticulture states are primarily in parts of Africa. Agricultural states are China, India, Japan, most of Latin America, etc. Individualism is probably where you would expect it to be. It's the United States and Western Europe. The other thing is that historically, for most of human history, people have been collectivists. The very idea of having individualist identities is really about 500 years old. It began with the Renaissance, and then it proceeded to develop and strengthen over the last 500 years. What I'd like you to consider is that these identities, collectivism and individualism, are not so easy to change because a collectivist self has collectivist institutions in back of it that support it. Same thing with individualist selves. So individuals are not free to choose differences in these identities like they're, pulling something out of a hat. It would take a great deal of socialization in order for that to change. So let me just begin with a pretty easy, straightforward definition, which will get more complicated as we go. Collectivism simply means that the group exists and is more important than the individual. Individualist societies say the individual comes first and social organizations are secondary or derivative. So what I'm going to do is go into a series of contrasts between collectivists and individualists and talk mostly about psychological and social psychological processes. The first major difference is something called power distance. Collectivists have what's called, and some of these terms are awkward terms. They're not terms I've invented, but there are terms that cross-cultural psychologists have used. Power distance means the degree of certainty or uncertainty that you have about the nature of your group relations. Collectivists have what's called high uncertainty avoidance. In other words, what that means is collectivists don't like definitions of people that are vague or not easily differentiated. Collectivists like to know what the roles are. They expect people to play by the rules, and they don't want things to be mushy. So let me give you, I'm going to try to pepper these contrasts with some examples that I think will, help to bring this to life. One of the times when I was teaching, when I started out teaching, the first place I taught was at a liberal arts college, which was, I would say, overwhelmingly individualist. As being an individualist myself, when I began to teach, I tended to dress down, number one. And number two, I would ask people to call me by my first name. Well, my students loved that. because it seemed like, okay, I'm being anti-authoritarian, which they preferred. But what I found is I was also teaching in the military. I taught at Travis Air Force Base, and I taught with the Navy. Well, in those settings, they refused to call me by my first name, and they expected me to look a certain way when I was teaching. In other words, you need to have a clear, your role is very clear, your name is professional, and you act like you are a teacher. And for collectivists, that means that they expect you to have be sort of, the sort of the well of knowledge. Collectivists don't like when other individuals in the classroom are talking because they don't think they can really learn from them. Individualists like it when teachers kind of blur the boundaries of what it means to be a teacher, talk informally with the students, share personal experiences with the students. Collectivists do not like that. And I found that out. And I learned this as I was teaching, that I could show some things when I'm teaching individualists, and I show other things when I'm teaching with collectivists. So power distance is very important, or power certainty is very important to collectivists. For individualism, individuals tend to be more critical of authority, so they like it when the authorities act in what they think is a more human way. A second major difference has to do with eye-to-eye contact. Individualists tend to think that if somebody looks you in the eye, it's a way of showing that you're sincere, that you're telling the truth. For collectivists, to look at an authority figure in the eye is a threat. It's seen as a threat by collectivists because the idea is that the authority figures look at you, you look away, and you only look at them when you're formally being addressed. Okay, now I want to go a little bit, I want to go away a little bit from the psychological and talk a little bit more sociologically, and then I'll come back. I think a good way to think about how a collectivist thinks about the relationship between society and the individual is like this. Collectivists think of an individual as organically connected to society and to the natural world. What that means is that all three are interdependent. And if I were to draw a picture of these kind of interlocking circles, I'd have a hard line around the area of nature. I'd have a hard line around the layer of society. And the individual would be in the center, but there would be kind of perforated dots around it, meaning that the individual was much weaker and their identity was more porous and more given to social expectations. For an individualist, what I would do is draw a hard line around the individual. It's almost like an individualist is kind of a castle that periodically opens up the drawbridge and goes out and has social relations. But social relations are seen as changing, as kind of necessary evil. But for the individualists, the most important thing is their social identity, and they relate to relations to people in the form of a contract. So you guys know, if you know anything about European history, there was social contract theory, Rousseau, and all those people. Well, individualists relate to society as if it were a form of a contract. Collectivists don't. Collectivists think of society as in your body, and you can't get out of it. So for individualists, we might say, okay, the terminology for this is, well, I don't really feel like being social today, so I'll stay home. And no, I'm more so when I want to be social, I will go to the party, I'll go to a party, I'll go to a market, I'll go to a political meeting. But it's a kind of choice. For the collectivist, there's no choice other than to be social. So it's not a contract. It's like an interdependent relationship that you can't get out of. Okay, I hope that makes sense. The next category is a pretty interesting one. It has to do with the relationship between context and content, okay? Collectivists are what's called high context, low content. I'll explain these in a minute. Individualists are less interested in context and more interested in content. So for collectivists, a really good example is, I may have given this example in another talk, but it's worth repeating. An anthropologist named Edward Hall was hired by Western capitalists to help them because their relationships with the Japanese in their business was not good. So he hired Hall and he asked these folks some questions. And the first thing he asked them was, well, what happens when you go to a business meeting? And the Western capitalists said, well, you know, we go out to lunch, I pull out the contract, and then we talk about the contract. And then that's it. And I'm very surprised that more times than not, these people don't call me back. So what Hall said is, he said, the Japanese don't operate the way you just described. The things that the Japanese talk about first, when they first meet you, is they ask you about your family lineage. They ask you about how long you've lived in the country. In other words, the Japanese are, and then after that, they go back and have a Japanese ceremony, tea ceremony. Business is not talked about at all. The idea, the Japanese way of looking at business is you first create an atmosphere. You're trying to build a long-term relationship with people, and creating an atmosphere is more important than whatever business contractions you want to work on together. And if you don't get to the business transactions at all the first day, that's okay, because it's part of building a longer-term relationship. Individualists don't put the same kind of work into rituals, because relations in individualist societies are often not seen as long-term. They're seen as short-term. And so why bother doing these rituals? But the thing to keep in mind generally, beyond this example of businesses, is that collectivists believe that atmosphere and ritual is vitally important. Individualists tend to not value these things. And a really clear indicator of that to me is if you look at the conditions in the United States of holidays and how meaningful are the holidays throughout the year for people. You know, if we go back far enough in collectivist societies, their rituals involve singing, dancing, costume making, storytelling, all part of what it makes a powerful ritual, what it makes to have a powerful ritual. They will have dessert, the fun part, the presents, after they do the work of the ritual. All I have to do is to tell you that when I was a kid growing up, when we had Christmas time, the only thing I cared about was the presents at the end. There was no talking about, we were Catholic, but there was no talking about or reenacting any kind of, the Stations of the Cross or any of that. That was all kind of like pushed away. And I think if you look at the other rituals around the country, then you think about Thanksgiving, you think about the 4th of July, you think of Memorial Day. I don't think many of those rituals have a whole lot of meaning for most people anymore. And that one of the things that happens is capitalism and rituals don't mix. And what capitalism as an individual, the heart of individualism does is it hollows out ritualistic tendencies and it reduces them to a commodity, like buying presents. So this is a major difference. Okay, another thing, back to more the psychological side. This category has to do with the relationship between individuals and roles. Individualists tend to look at roles as something that's put on and taken off over the course of a day. So for example, I get up in the morning, I go to work, I'm a teacher. Then I go after work and I go to a political meeting. Then I'm doing something, now I have another role. Then I come home and I'm with my partner, I'm in the role of partner. So those are 3 roles. But the individualist tends to say that even though I'm playing these roles, there's an internal essence to me that's my real true self. And this is the kind of stuff that humanistic psychology will talk about and say, well, these roles are things I have to do, but my real identity is inside of me and it's independent of roles. For the collectivists, roles are all there are. People are not putting on masks when they play roles as collectivists. The roles are all there is. And the idea that you would say, me as an individual are beyond all these roles, and I need to pay attention to this individualist identity, collectivists look at that as being selfish. So this is just the tip of the iceberg because, depending on what happens, the next time I give a talk, or one of the next times I can talk about the record of Western psychotherapy when it's used on collectivists. And I can tell you it's not very good for reasons like this. Another interesting category, I'm just going to focus on the categories I think are most interesting, and I want to make sure we have enough time for discussion. Another really interesting category is attitude towards strangers. Strangers for collectivists are a much bigger deal than for individualists. For collectivists, they'll do 2 things with a stranger. They'll either bring them in and insist on making them their own, or they'll drive you away in some way or another. Like I had, when I used to hitchhike through the South in the early 1970s, I hitchhiked from Atlanta all the way through Louisiana before I got to the West Coast. And I can tell you, I had people there that put me up for an evening, took me back to their farm, spent the night, things that never happened to me when I hitchhiked in the North. But as I continued to travel through the South, I would have people throwing stuff at me, from pickup trucks, right? So there's a kind of like, you're either pulled in or you're thrown out with collectivists. Individualists have a much more adaptive attitude towards strangers because for individualists, we're dealing with strangers so much as part of the day that there's a kind of superficial friendliness, an acknowledgement. You don't ask people a whole lot of questions about themselves when they're strangers, but you do enough to make relationships polite. civil. And of course, the reason for this is because of capitalism. Capitalism needs strangers to get along in a superficial way. And so it can't afford to be asking all these questions. Like, for example, this is another hitchhiking story. We stopped off in a really small town as the sun was going down. I wasn't even sure where we were, but we needed to get some food and some gas. So we stopped off, we went in a supermarket, and it was dinner time. And we thought, oh man, we're gonna get caught in a line because all these people are gonna be shopping. There was only one person in front of us when we got our food. We went up to the cashiers, one person in front of us. The person in front of us began a long discussion with the cashier about how their kids were and how work was and what the weather's going to be. And we're standing in line here and we're thinking, what the heck is going on? Because as individualists, we want the line to move fast and we don't want people asking extensive questions about other people. We just want to get going. So there's another example. The small town was a collectivist orientation. They mix business with pleasure when they're in their shopping. It's not like you just go in, you buy your stuff, you leave. For collectivists, that's cold. Individualists, that's kind of normal. Okay. Okay, another typical category in psychology is something some of you probably know about. It's called internal. It has to do with causal attributions. There's external locus of control, internal locus of control. As you probably know, for the most part, but this varies based on social class. For the most part, individualists that are at least middle class or beyond have an internal locus of control. That simply means that whatever happens to them, more or less, is their responsibility. And there's usually an unwillingness to look at external factors as to why you're a certain way. It's kind of like a concession to admit that there could be external forces. For collectivists, they have an external locus of control. What that means is what happens to me is really the will of the gods. It is luck, it's fate, right? But the idea for a collectivist of having individual responsibility for what happens to you is a very foreign concept. And so again, anybody that does psychotherapy with a collectivist is up against this external locus of control that is not the individual's psychological decision. It comes out of a whole cultural tradition about the nature of the relationship between human beings and external forces. The idea is that external forces are more powerful. And so, with all these, as I hope you'll understand, I think maybe we can assume this, is that there's pros and cons to all these things. There's advantages and disadvantages about being individualist and collectivist. Let me do one or two more, and then we can just open this up for a discussion. Okay, let me get to some of these questions I raised, because I raised this stuff in the description, and I realize I haven't covered it. So let me try to cover at least a couple. Is storm and stress a normal part of teenage life around the world? Well, it is for some social classes of individualism, right? Like the James Dean story about the rebel without a cause. Storm and stress is not part of a collectivist teenage identity. That's something that, as part of Erikson's stages of development, that doesn't really show up with collectivists. Part of the reason is because collectivists don't have a separate culture of teenage years. In other words, collectivists, by the time they are 12 years old, they are already working with the family, working on the farm. And so there isn't an opportunity to create another kind of identity that's separate from adult life. For individualists, if you look at where this came from, as long as individuals in the 19th century, at least working class people, would go to work in the factories, they're not going to have identity crisis over the teenage years. They're too busy working. But maybe some of you know, towards the end of the 19th century, one of the things the unions did was they forced young kids out of the factories. And they did that because you can't have a decent strike if you have teenagers or people that are very young there, because they're not strong enough to withstand all the things that are done to them during the strike. So the workers pretty much drove teenagers and younger kids out of the factories. Then eventually, public schools developed. And as public schools develop, these children are pulled off the workforce into the schools. And once they're in the schools, they began to develop a separate identity, and they start to develop a tension between themselves as a group and the adults around them. And it's out of that comes this kind of teenage identity that's separate from adults. But it really exists only as a certain part of history. It's certainly not all around the world. And it's only true in the United States for a little more than a century. Okay, one more point. Okay, I'm just going to say something about marriages. One of the things that's pretty interesting about this is that when they did a survey about who's happy and not happy in marriages, what was interesting is that across the board, all around the world, cross-cultural, universal, men are happier in marriage than women are, regardless of whether you're an individualist or a collectivist, okay? However, collectivist men are happier than individualist men, and collectivist women are the most unhappy compared to individualist women. So individualist men and women are sort of in the center of the spectrum, and the men and women of collectivists are on the extreme ends. Part of the reason for that is in the West, the presence of feminism and these other movements has made the distance between men and women less. But collectivists do not have feminist movements. They're much more patriarchal. And so you can imagine that the collectivist women are working extremely hard, much harder than the men are. And so it would make sense that the men register happiness more than the women do. But what's interesting is that the men and women in individualist societies are sort of in the middle in terms of happiness. So there's so much more to say about this. I mean, all these talks that I give, they come out of probably, in about 2.5 hours, 3 hours of class. We have discussions, qualifications. I can't do that kind of stuff here. So some of this stuff, these contrasts won't have the qualifications that you might expect and like. I can't do anything about that. The time is too short. Hopefully we can bring some of this up during the questionnaire. So we still got some time for that. So thank you for listening to me, and I'd like to hear your 2 cents.
Please, everyone, feel free to unmute yourselves and give Bruce a round of applause.